Man, Marvel's rebooting Spider-Man, and the ending to this comic is amazing, right? God, I'm so excited to see where this comic goes. So this is Ultimate Spider-Man #1, and this comic basically opens up in January. Now, the reason why that's the case is because the Ultimate Universe, or at least this new Ultimate Universe going forward, will be much like the old one in the sense that it's kind of the answer to the question, what if superheroes existed in this real world? What would it look like? And so you'll see a lot of reflection of what goes on in the world right now reflected in the comics. So it's really, really cool, right? Jonathan Hickman does an amazing job with this. So a few things to know. #1, Peter Parker never became Spider-Man, and Peter Parker's got kids. Right now, the reason why Peter Parker never became Spider-Man was covered during the story Ultimate Invasion, which we have covered, and you'll find a link to that at the ending of this video. But the important thing here is that, in effect, Peter Parker, as most of you guys know, gets bitten by a radioactive spider in his teenage years, and he goes on to become Spider-Man. That was stopped. And because he was never bitten by a radioactive spider, he never became Spider-Man. He just grew up as a guy that eventually got a job at the Daily Bugle. Now, his two kids, it's kind of cool, right? Richard and May, of course, being named after members of his family. That Richard is named after his father, Richard Parker, and his daughter is named after Aunt May, right? May Parker. There's actually a reason for that. So you guys are going to find this is going to very, very closely, not really mirror, but have concepts from what you've seen in the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies from the MCU. Of course, Mary Jane Watson is here as well. And basically life is great for him, right? Like they got a family and they do their thing and everything's for the most part pretty cool. But what ends up happening, and one of the things that I want you guys to notice here, is that there's this kind of ball that May Parker has in her possession, right? It almost looks like a crystal ball. Now, of course, Peter Parker takes that away and says, that's not a toy. Keep that in the back of your head because that is going to be stupendously important by the time we get to the end of this comic. And I'm curious to see if anybody can figure it out, right? As you're watching this video, leave a comment down below and let me know if you're able to figure out what the deal is with that crystal ball. But what you end up doing is transitioning to the Daily Bugle. Now, for the most part, life in the Daily Bugle is exactly as you would expect. J. Jonah Jameson is still a dick. He still yells at people all the time, and we all still love him for it. Right? Like Peter Parker's still here doing his Peter Parker thing, but there's a big difference, a big caveat, because there is another office that is ran by the managing editor, and this guy is Ben Parker. Uncle Ben never died. Uncle Ben was never killed, right? He's very much alive. As soon as I saw this, I was like, really? Right? I literally just sat up in my seat. I was like, okay, let's see where this goes, Jonathan Hickman. Now, one of the things that's kind of funny here is that seemingly J. Jonah Jameson and Ben Parker have been working together for decades, right? Like 20, maybe 30 years at this point. And in fact, when Peter Parker shows up here, he and Ben Parker are supposed to be going on some kind of a walk or basically meeting and talking and so on and so forth. But there's a kind of back and forth here that I absolutely adore, right? Like Peter Parker shows up here. He's like, Uncle Ben, are you ready? And Ben's like, I was ready 15 minutes ago, Peter. Why are you late? And he's like, well, it's probably because I was neither on time nor early, right? A Parker arrives precisely when he means to. Like, I love that, right? And so the response of Ben, that's cute. The response of J. Jonah Jameson, kids these days, always being cute, always being clever. And Ben's response, never clever enough to show up on time. And the response of J. Jonah Jameson, but clever nonetheless. There is a strong camaraderie here between these guys that I love, and I never realized I needed it until now. Kudos, Jonathan Hickman. You did a fantastic job, right? And even then, like Peter's just kind of like, you guys should have your own show, right? So it's awesome the way that it's done, right? Like Peter Parker, J. Jonah Jameson, Ben Parker. I mean, it's just this amazing little thing. And so what you do is you end up finding out that, of course, J. Jonah Jameson, in a lot of ways, much like what we're familiar with the mainline or main Marvel Universe comics, really in more recent years, J. Jonah Jameson, I wouldn't go so far as to say is like a father figure for Peter, because of course that's really what Uncle Ben is. More like a mentor, because he pulls him aside for a second and is like, where's your tie? And he's like, well, I never really wear a tie. I really don't even own one. And the response of J. Jonah Jameson, you have to wear a tie, right? Take off your jacket. And he presents him with a tie. And he kind of sits around and talks to him, right? He's like, have I ever told you about how much we love to sit around and talk about our feelings, your uncle and I? And it's a really, really touching moment, right? Because J. Jonah Jameson says, your uncle is the toughest son of a gun that I've ever met. Asking if he's okay is kind of like asking about the durability of stone or some other geological remnant of another time. Saying that, how about you and I, regardless of how it appears he's doing, keep a close lookout for any cracks that we might see. Can we agree to that? And the response of Peter is yes, right? So very much Ben Parker is an old school guy. And so what you end up getting is this moment where Peter is talking to Ben and he kind of asks him the question, like, everybody's wondering if you're doing okay. Like, everybody wants to know how you're doing. The response of Ben, everyone is not wondering if I'm okay, Peter. Everyone doesn't care. We work at the Bugle. So you and me, we're in the words business. If there's something you want to say, don't hide your intent. Just go ahead and say it. Then everyone, quote unquote, will respect you because you did. And his response, fair enough. Like, I'm worried about you. Ben asks why, and he says, what do you mean why? You won't talk about what happened. You haven't said anything, not one word about how you're doing or how you feel. And so what's really, really interesting here is in this conversation, Ben talks about the idea that when he arrived on the doorstep of Ben and May Parker 15 years ago, following the death of his parents, that they took him in as their own and raised him as their own son, but never tried to replace his parents. And he says, it's been a long time, but has one day gone by that you didn't think about them? Is there one day that it doesn't hurt that they're gone? The response of Peter, no. The response of Ben, then you know exactly how I feel. Aunt May died. Now here's the big difference here. It's not like the main Marvel universe where Aunt May was killed in the same way that Uncle Ben was killed in the comics, in the sense that, like, Peter allowed some mugger to run by, because the guy was ripping him off or whatever. It's one of these things where she was killed in the Stark explosion in Ultimate Invasion. So for those of you guys who aren't familiar with that, right, kind of touching back a little bit on Ultimate Invasion, because this will be a linchpin for most everything that goes forward in the future of the Ultimate Universe. So I highly suggest you watch it. The long and short is that there was an alternate reality version of Reed Richards called The Maker. He came from the original Ultimate Universe, which doesn't exist anymore. So you can largely ignore its existence. But what The Maker wanted to do is he wanted to recreate his original universe. So he traveled to this reality and then just started changing things. But one of the things he did is he formed the Illuminati, which operated behind the scenes. In the absence of the Maker, who was the leader of the group, the Illuminati started basically orchestrating events behind the scenes to kind of secure power, consolidate power, different things like that. One of the events that had transpired in Ultimate Invasion is that the Stark building was blown up to make it look like a Stark accident, when the reality here is it was an orbital satellite that was fired in order to blow the building to pieces. The result is that while Tony Stark is seemingly believed to be dead, even though we know he's not, that explosion killed a boatload of people in the city of New York. So it's really one of these things where it seems like annually they get together and they mourn the loss of these people. And so what you end up getting here is the realization that Aunt May was killed in this explosion. Not only that, Matt Murdock seemingly never became Daredevil. He just became a priest within the Catholic Church, right? He's referred to as like Father Murdock. And so while he gives this speech to everybody and explains everything that's going on, or at least kind of talking about the loss, but for the most part also kind of ties it to Ultimate Invasion for us as the reader, that he actually says there is a person here who wants to speak. The people that he lost here were Emily and Norman Osborn. This is their son, Harry. So Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, he's dead, gone. He's not in the picture anymore, right? He was killed as well. But something that I want you to notice as Harry stands up and he makes this speech, right? The idea that they come together and he says, we gather here every year in order to honor the lives of those who were lost, right? To remind them that we love them and to remind ourselves that as a city, we will endure, right? But he says, it's just not enough. And I'm not sure any of us would be expected to live with it. There's an anger here that Harry Osborn has, a deep-seated anger over this loss, and it will manifest itself. Because what you do is you pick up at the Daily Bugle, and literally as Peter and Ben get back here, J. Jonah Jameson is pitching a fit, throws papers in the air, walks out and says, I quit, right? Like, I'm done. Just leaves. And so at that point, Ben's like, okay, Peter, like, go to your desk, keep your head down. We'll catch up later. When Ben gets into the boardroom, you end up having Robbie Robertson, right? Who is like the second in command to J. Jonah Jameson, right? He basically says, like, so here's the rub, man. Like, between the board and the advertisers and folks like that, they don't like how it is that we're covering the Stark explosion. Advertisers are threatening to pull out. We're gonna lose money and we'll end up shutting down. And because news is a profit-driven institution, we have to keep the advertisers, right? Above anything else, the question has to be asked, is the news that we're reporting and how we're reporting it, is it keeping the coffers full? Truth comes second. And so Robbie Robertson says J. Jonah Jameson just didn't really care for the changes, and so he quit. Then Ben Parker asked Robbie the question, how do you feel about them, Robbie? His response, I'm 2 years away from maxing out my pension, and I feel like it would just be a good idea. So at the end of the day, Robbie's like, I'm just going forward with it. Now here's the thing, right? This is gonna piss off some Spider-Man fans because Robbie Robertson has a small but very dedicated fan base. And Robbie Robertson is nothing if not a man devoted to the truth in the main Marvel universe. So seeing the Ultimate Universe kind of flip him on his head and say, I mean, do I agree with what they're doing? It doesn't really matter. What matters is I'm 2 years away from maxing out my pension and potentially retiring. I don't really much care for doing what's right or wrong. I care about making it to the finish line and calling it a day. So some folks will probably be a little offended by that. I'm curious to see how people are going to respond to it, right? But the fact remains here that Robbie Robertson says because of all these things, right, you know, the advertisers and so on, we're making some changes, right, at the behest of both the board and broader leadership in general. And where Ben asked the question, how do you think I should feel about that? His response, or at least a statement, comes from the Kingpin Wilson Fisk, who says, you should be pleased at your good fortune. After all, nature abhors a vacuum. And it's like, well, what do you mean, Mr. Fisk, right? And his response is, Jameson's out. Now the paper needs new leadership. You are the obvious choice. And so I suppose congratulations are in order, Mr. Parker. It seems you've got your promotion. That's if you want the job, of course, and if you can toe the line. So it seems like Wilson Fisk basically owns the Daily Bugle, right? He owns an entire newspaper. Now, of course, this in a lot of ways is an allegory probably to Elon Musk owning Twitter, but the fact remains here, right? Like, everybody looks at Ben Parker to see his reaction, and all he does is smile, walk out of the office, and join J. Jonah Jameson in the elevator and leave. Now, I will say this, if Jonathan Hickman, which I couldn't imagine him doing this, if Jonathan Hickman had written it in such a way to where he had crafted this situation where Ben Parker just kind of dropped his head in sadness and said, okay, it would have pissed off the Spider-Man universe to no end. So it would have been absolutely crazy. But the point is that later on, as Wilson Fisk is getting out of his vehicle, he's suddenly attacked out of nowhere by the Green Goblin, who obviously is Harry Osborne here, right? Now, we only see him for a second, because what you do is you transition to the bar with no name, which is an obvious allegory to the bar in the main Marvel universe, which is a sign for like wizards and witches and people who specify or who specialize in magic and all that kind of stuff, and only people with magical abilities can access it. That's clearly not the case here. This is just a bar out there in New York that just doesn't have a name on it. But the fact remains that you have this really interesting debate between J. Jonah Jameson and Benjamin Parker, where they kind of go back and forth, right? And they talk about all this stuff, everything that's happened so far. And the thing about J. Jonah Jameson is he kind of laughs at Ben Parker, because Ben Parker is like, we should do our own thing, right? Like, we should launch our own news organization, you know? And he's like, the easy thing about this is like, we do it right. And where J. Jonah Jameson is like, what does that look like doing it right? The response of Ben is, it's easy. We tell the truth. And J. Jonah Jameson just kind of laughs out loud because he makes this argument and he says, there's no room for truth in news, right? People know the truth, people ignore the truth. People want the facts they want to hear, right? He's like, he almost takes a page out of like the newsroom, right? Where he says like, in this day and age, right? In this era, right now, people choose the facts they want. So whether or not you present them with the truth is irrelevant. But Benjamin Parker has a lot more faith in people than J. Jonah Jameson does, because his stance is no. Right? Sure, there are people out there that choose the facts they want, but we can convince them by showing them what's really going on out there, bringing honest to goodness, real, truthful journalism. We can make that work. But at the end of the day, the stance of J. Jonah Jameson and even the wisdom and experience he brings to the table cannot be denied. There is truth in him making the statement that there's no truth in the news and no news in truth. And so he's like, it's a dirty business. That's just the way that it is. This is not me bringing my personal beliefs to the table. It's 30 years working in this industry and watching how people absorb the news that informs this belief system. And so he says, how about this, right? We promise that we simply won't lie. That's what we promise to do. We simply just don't lie to people. Now, this is where the ending that I was telling you about gets crazy, because what you do here is you have Peter Parker who walks in on the two of these guys and just starts talking to them, right? He basically, word got around to him that they ultimately left the Daily Bugle, and they offer him a job, right? And he's like, do you guys have any money? And they're like, that's a day 2 problem, Peter. He says, tonight, I am a man who is right with the world, right? J. Jonah Jameson's like, we'll worry about the cash later on. And he's like, think it over, Peter, right? And so Peter asked this question. He was like, Ben, I gotta know, right? Like, how did you blow your whole life up in one afternoon and then just start a new one? And the response of Ben is, because there is nothing else. I have nothing else, right? You're a grown man, Peter Parker. You're not my child anymore, or at least what would be my child. Aunt May's dead. It's just me, a man in the world by myself. I can start and stop a new life every day if I choose to. But the reality is the choice was easy, right? Like, either I stay as just a guy out here in the world, working for a newspaper, publishing news in a way that I don't agree with because the man who runs the show demands that I toe the party line, or I quit. And I basically do what I believe to be the right thing for myself. Because in Uncle Ben's case, at his age, all that matters is speaking his truth and being his true self, because that's all he has left. It's very easy for us as people, and even like this personal honesty and living the life that we want to live, it's very easy for all of that to fall to the wayside in the face of life's struggles and in the face of life's responsibilities. Peter's dealing with that right now because he's like, I have a wife, I have children. I can't just uproot, quit a full-time job and leave and go to this place, right? Just go do a thing because it's like my destiny or something along those lines. And Uncle Ben starts to pick up on the fact that Peter is not talking about the Daily Bugle, the job that he has there, and working for Uncle Ben and working for J. Jonah Jameson. There's something else going on here, right? And he was like, what's the deal? He's like, are you and MJ okay, right? And the response of Peter, I mean, yeah, I'm great, she's great, and she says that I think she deserves better than me, but she disagrees, which makes it even better, right? Because she's with me because she loves me, he says, for the longest time, I've thought something was wrong with my life, Ben, that something was wrong with me. I can't really explain it, but now I just know that I've been right all along, and I don't know what to do. The life that I'm living is not the life that I was supposed to live. And the response of Ben is, have you ever heard the saying that inaction is action, right? The response of Peter, yes. And so Ben in turn says, that's just a garbage way of saying, don't spend your life waiting for something to happen. Make it happen, right? And he says, I love you, son, but if you're walking around half asleep, anesthetized by your own life, then it's time to wake up. And so Peter, of course, says goodnight to his kids, and he says goodnight to Mary Jane Watson, and he talks about how he needs to pursue a grander purpose. And she asks the question, does this change things between us? He says, absolutely not. She's like, then go do your thing. And so what you do is you pick up with Peter on a rooftop, right? And he's holding this crystal ball in his hand. And what it does is it jumps back to the night before, right? Before this comic picked up, right? And you get this message, right? This is for Peter Parker, right? And he says, hello, if this has gone as I'd hoped, I am speaking with Peter Parker. It's Tony Stark Iron Man, or at least a holographic projection of him. And he says, my name is Tony Stark. And while it's likely that you know my father's name, you've probably never heard of me. Now, of course, because Tony Stark was blamed for the explosion in New York, everybody knows his name, right? And he says, I'm sending this to you from 6 months into the future. There was an attempt on my and my companions' lives, and we only had seconds to escape before the orbital platform fired. And that's when Peter's like, wait, we never heard anything about an orbital platform firing at the building, right? So that's when he starts to realize he's only got half the equation here. And so Tony continues on and he says, so we went to the only safe place that I could think of. And he says, I'm sorry I can't be more specific than I'm about to be, but we have to be careful because this world is more complicated and dangerous than you could ever believe. And there's a component of faith to this that frankly is unavoidable. And he says, all I ask is that you please listen carefully. And he says, inside this, right, this ball that he has in his hand is a Picotech stealth suit to mask your identity and a bioorganic catalyst necessary for you to undergo a post-human transformation. And Peter, of course, flabbergasted, says, what in the world is this supposed to mean? The response of Iron Man, 20 years ago, you were supposed to be bitten by a radioactive spider. This would have given you amazing powers, and with them, you would have become one of Earth's most prominent superheroes. Instead, a great evil traveled through time and erased almost all the heroes of this world from existence. You were one of them. He did this so that he and his confederates, i.e. the Illuminati, could treat Earth as a kind of experiment, an exercise in creating a society that could be perfectly directed and controlled. I am repeating this with 6 others like you, and in 6 months, if I've done this correctly, I will exit this room to find an Earth that has regained its heroes, and together we will free the world. It is my greatest hope that you are among our number. And of course, he says, you are supposed to have a different life, Peter Parker. You are supposed to protect the innocent, save lives, and inspire the citizens of this world to be their best selves. And instead, all of that was taken from you. So what it does is it jumps to this current moment right now, right? Because Peter's kind of flashing back between this, when the last thing that Iron Man asked him is, do you want that life back, right? This ball, this crystal ball opens up in his hands. And when it does, a smaller ball comes out. And what he finds here is a little tube with a radioactive spider, the exact spider that was supposed to bite him. And he kind of recollects on this idea, Uncle Ben telling him, if you believe that you've been anesthetized by your own life, it's time to wake up. The response of MJ, if you believe you're meant for a greater destiny, then go and get it. And so Peter Parker takes the spider out of the vial, puts it on his hand, and finds himself bitten, and officially becomes Spider-Man. It's amazing. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. I loved this comic. It's a slow burn, but it's great. If you guys need to get caught up on Ultimate Invasion and how we got to this point, make sure you guys click the link to this playlist, and I will catch you all later. Peace.